Chapter 92. Tension. "Hey, you!" Radgar called out, his voice carrying across the room. "You've got some nerve. Barging in here like that." The traveler didn't respond. He merely reached up to scratch the cat behind its ears, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he hadn't heard Radgar at all. Radgar's eyes narrowed, and the men at his table exchanged uneasy glances. Greta could sense the tension building again, the room teetering on the edge of something dangerous. But the traveler remained unfazed, his silence and stillness somehow more unnerving than any words he could have spoken. The cat purred softly, its eyes half closed as it enjoyed the attention, utterly unconcerned with the brewing storm around it. Greta's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the scene unfold. She knew Radgar well enough to know that he wouldn't let this perceived slight go unchallenged. Yet there was something about the traveler that made her think he wasn't someone to be trifled with despite his rough appearance. Radgar took a step forward, his posture aggressive. "I'm talking to you, traveler. You'd better show some respect or—" The traveler finally lifted his head, his hood falling back just enough to reveal piercing pitch-black eyes that seemed to hold a depth of experience far beyond his years. He didn't speak, but the look he gave Radgar was enough to stop the man in his tracks. And then the newcomer slowly lowered his hood, revealing the face underneath that caused a ripple of surprise to pass through the room. He was indeed young, as many had suspected, but his features were striking. His skin was pale, almost luminescent in the dim light of the inn, with a chiseled jawline and high cheekbones that gave him an air of refinement. His face was smooth, devoid of the roughness of a seasoned warrior, but there was something about his expression, calm, composed and slightly cold, that suggested a life far from ordinary. What caught everyone's attention, however, was not just the traveler's youth or the sharpness of his features, but the long scar that marred the right side of his face, running from his brow down past his cheek. It cut through the pristine white of his skin like a jagged reminder of violence, giving him a menacing edge despite the otherwise handsome visage. The most unsettling aspect, though, were his eyes, pitch black, like twin voids that seemed to absorb the very light around him. Those eyes, filled with an unnerving depth, held Radgar's gaze firmly, freezing him in place. The silence that followed the reveal of the traveler's face was thick and oppressive, as if the very air in the room had solidified. Radgar blinked, a momentary flicker of doubt crossing his face. "He's just a kid," he thought, trying to dismiss the sudden fear that had gripped him. "A damn kid with a scar." But the doubt lingered, gnawing at the edges of his bravado. How could this young man, barely more than a boy, with his rough clothes and traveler's gear, make him feel so intimidated? Radgar clenched his fists, trying to force the unease away, telling himself that the kid's cold demeanor and scar were nothing to fear. The traveler, seemingly unbothered by the attention, turned his gaze away from Radgar and looked over to Greta, who was still standing nearby, her body tense and uncertain. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm and steady, carrying a surprising amount of authority. "I'd like a meal, please. Something warm." The request was simple and polite, but it was the complete disregard for Radgar's presence that made it sting. Radgar's jaw tightened, his face turning a shade of red as he realized he was being ignored. The crowd in the inn watched with bated breath, sensing the confrontation that was about to unfold. Greta hesitated for a split second before nodding, grateful for the distraction from Radgar's unwelcome attention. "Of course," she replied, her voice soft but steady. She quickly moved toward the kitchen, eager to fulfill the traveler's request and to put some distance between herself and Radgar. But as she turned away, Radgar snapped. The humiliation of being dismissed by this stranger in front of the entire inn was too much for him to bear. He took another step forward, his posture more aggressive than before. "Hey, I'm talking to you, you little shit," he spat, his voice loud and furious. The traveler didn't react immediately, still focused on Greta's retreating form. But when he did turn his attention back to Radgar, it was with an expression of cold indifference, as if the larger man's outburst was nothing more than an annoyance. Radgar's anger flared even hotter, fueled by the disdain he perceived in the traveler's eyes. He was used to being feared, respected, or at the very least, obeyed, especially now that he had the backing of the Baron. This boy's calm defiance was something he wasn't prepared for, and it set his blood boiling. "You think you can just walk in here, ignore me, and get away with it?" Radgar snarled, his hand moving to the hilt of the sword at his side. "I'll teach you some respect." The young man's lips curled into a smirk, the expression clearly mocking Radgar. His pitch-black eyes gleamed with a mix of amusement and challenge as he leaned back slightly in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "Really? And how exactly do you plan to teach me this respect?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. The taunt hit its mark. Radgar's eyes flared with anger, the heat of his fury making his vision narrow to the smirking face before him. The blood pounded in his ears, drowning out the murmurs of the onlookers as his grip on the hilt of his sword tightened. The young man's calm defiance, the audacity to mock him in front of everyone, was more than Radgar could bear. "Who the hell do you think you are, you little shit?" Radgar spat, his voice low and dangerous. "You must be new around here, so let me educate you." Radgar's words dripped with venom, but they also carried a weight that sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. There was a reason why Radgar commanded fear in Rakenshore beyond his position in the garrison and the Baron's backing. Radgar wasn't just any soldier. He was an awakened, a man who had unlocked a level of power beyond that of ordinary folk. To even be considered for the garrison, one had to be at least a one-star awakened, someone who had tapped into the latent energy within themselves, enhancing their strength, speed, and abilities far beyond normal human limits. Radgar had been fortunate enough to possess the talent to awaken, a fact that he wielded like a weapon to assert his dominance over the people of Rakenshore. The room seemed to shrink around them, the tension mounting as Radgar's anger grew. The other patrons exchanged nervous glances, fully aware of what Radgar was capable of. His temper was notorious, and everyone knew that once it was unleashed, there was no turning back. The young traveler, however, didn't flinch. If anything, his smirk grew wider, as if he found the whole situation entertaining. He leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but edged with a sharpness that cut through the tension. "Oh, I'm well aware of what you are. A one-star awakened, right?" He paused, letting the words sink in, his smirk never faltering. "But tell me, do you really think that makes you strong?" The question hung in the air, its implication clear. Radgar was indeed stronger than the average person in Rakenshore. Stronger than any of the patrons in the inn and stronger even than most of the garrison. But the way the young man spoke, with such confidence and derision, suggested that he didn't consider Radgar's awakening to be impressive at all. For a split second, Ragna considered that maybe this bastard might be a child of a noble or something. But there was no way a noble's child would have such a scar on his face. Radgar's rage exploded. "You little bastard!" he roared, drawing his sword fully and advancing on the traveler with murderous intent. The patrons gasped, some shrinking back in their seats, others instinctively reaching for their own weapons, though none dared to intervene. The young man remained seated, his eyes never leaving Radgar's as the larger man loomed over him, sword poised to strike. But instead of fear, his expression held nothing but a smirk. The same smirk that was there. "You think you can just mock me and walk away?" Radgar snarled, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "I'll show you what happens to those who disrespect me." Radgar's sword gleamed in the dim light of the inn as he raised it, ready to bring it down on the traveler with all the force. Swoosh! The blade fell down as it reached the young man. Spurt, and following that, blood spurted to the ground. Chapter 93. Tension. 2. Silence. The inn fell into stunned silence, the air thick with the sudden, sharp scent of blood. Every eye was fixed on the scene, the tension that had built to a fever pitch now breaking with the sight of crimson splattering across the wooden floor. The sound of the sword cutting through the air and the subsequent spurt of blood seemed to echo in the minds of everyone present, a brutal punctuation to the violence that had erupted so suddenly. Radgar stood frozen, his sword still raised, his breath coming in harsh, ragged gasps. His eyes were wide, his expression a mix of rage and disbelief. For a moment, it was as if he couldn't comprehend what had just happened. The young man, still seated, had not moved from his chair. His smirk had not faltered, and his pitch-black eyes remained fixed on Radgar. But the blood, everyone could see it now, was not his. It was Radgar's blood that stained the floor, dripping steadily from a deep gash across his forearm, where the traveler's unseen blade had cut through flesh and muscle with precise, lethal efficiency. The patrons, who had shrunk back in their seats, now stared in a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. While fights had broken out in the inn before, and there had been threats and bluster aplenty, this was the first time they had seen blood spilled so openly in this place, especially the blood of a man as feared as Radgar. The shock of it reverberated through the room, turning the once lively inn into a space of hushed whispers and fearful glances. No one dared to move or speak too loudly lest they draw attention to themselves. Radgar, still reeling from the sudden wound, staggered back, clutching his arm. His sword clattered to the ground, forgotten in his pain and confusion. The look on his face was one of utter disbelief that this young man, whom he had dismissed as a mere traveler, had not only mocked him but had drawn his blood with such ease. The young man slowly stood up from his chair, his movements calm and deliberate. As he rose to his full height, the small cat that had been sitting on the table hopped back onto his shoulder as if it, too, were unfazed by the violence that had just occurred. The traveler's eyes never left Radgar, his expression unreadable as he regarded the man who had tried to cut him down. You bastard," Radgar hissed through clenched teeth, his voice trembling with a mixture of pain and anger. But the fire that had driven him moments before had dimmed, replaced by a growing fear that he could no longer hide. The traveler finally spoke, his voice as cold and cutting as the blade that had wounded Radgar. "I told you," he said softly, the words barely more than a whisper, yet carrying the weight of a death sentence. "You made a mistake." The inn remained deathly quiet, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Greta, who had returned from the kitchen just in time to witness the aftermath, stood frozen in place, her eyes wide with shock. The sight of the blood on the floor, the realization that the young man had drawn it without so much as standing up, filled her with a mix of fear and awe. The men who had followed Radgar into the inn were now standing in a tight cluster, their faces pale with fear and anger. The sight of their leader, Radgar, cut down so effortlessly had shaken them to their core, but there was something else gnawing at them, an indignation that burned just beneath the surface. They had spent months, even years, building their reputation in Rakenshore, thriving on the fear and respect that their newfound power had afforded them. And now, in mere moments, that reputation was crumbling before their eyes. Radgar, though wounded and clearly in pain, couldn't let go of the humiliation. His gaze flicked between the young man seated before him and his own men, and the rage that had fueled him moments before began to rekindle. He hated this, hated the fact that he had been bested so easily, hated the idea that the people in this inn, people who had once cowered before him, were now watching his downfall. He gritted his teeth, trying to push through the pain and the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. "I can't let it end like this," he thought, his pride screaming for retaliation. His eyes met those of his men, and in that brief exchange, a silent understanding passed between them. Each one of them nodded, their expressions hardening as they prepared to restore their shattered honor. But before they could take a single step, the young man raised his head, his black eyes locking onto theirs with a calm, cold gaze. His voice, when he spoke, was soft but carried a chilling certainty that made the blood in their veins turn to ice. "What you're thinking right now is not a good idea." The men froze, their bravado faltering as the young man's words cut through the tension like a knife. They exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence wavering under the weight of his gaze. But then, one of them, a burly man with a scarred face, managed to smirk, his attempt to regain control evident in the forced expression. "And why's that, huh?" The man sneered, his voice tinged with a bravado that rang hollow in the silence of the room. "You think we're just gonna let you walk out of here after what you did to Radgar?" The young man didn't blink, didn't move. His expression remained unchanged, the calm in his eyes unwavering. "Because once my blade is drawn," he said quietly, his words laced with an edge sharper than any sword, "it never goes back into the sheath without cutting." The meaning behind his words was clear, deadly clear. "Hence, I suggest you stand back, or else, I will not show any mercy this time." The moment the young man's words hung in the air, the men felt it. A cold, suffocating pressure that seemed to descend upon them, wrapping around their chests and squeezing the breath from their lungs. It wasn't just fear. It was something far more primal, something that clawed at the deepest recesses of their instincts. "What is this?" one of the men thought, his heart hammering in his chest as a wave of sheer terror washed over him. It wasn't just the young man's calm demeanor or his threatening words. It was something far darker, something raw and unbridled, that filled the room like a dense, suffocating fog. The intent they felt wasn't just any ordinary killing intent. It was bloodthirst, pure and unfiltered. It was the kind of bloodthirst that only a seasoned killer, one who had taken countless lives, could exude. The air was thick with it, heavy and oppressive, as if they were standing in the presence of a beast, a predator that had no qualms about tearing them apart. Their instincts screamed at them to run, to flee from this force that was so much greater than anything they had ever encountered. The young man before them was no mere traveler. He was a slaughterer, someone who had bathed in the blood of others, someone who knew how to kill and wouldn't hesitate to do so. "Young man." The oppressive atmosphere in the inn was suddenly punctuated by a voice, deep and resonant, coming from the entrance. All eyes turned toward the source of the voice. Standing in the doorway was an old man, his figure broad and imposing despite his age. His belly was large, a testament to a life well lived, but there was no mistaking the strength in his stance or the authority in his presence. His face, though lined with the wrinkles of time, radiated a fatherly warmth and calmness that contrasted sharply with the suffocating tension in the room. The young man, still seated at his table, slowly turned his head to regard the newcomer. The bloodthirst that had hung in the air like a thick fog seemed to waver, its oppressive weight shifting slightly as the old man's calm voice cut through the silence. "Young man," the old man repeated, his tone gentle but firm, "it's better for you to control that bloodthirst. You're suffocating everyone here, not just those fools." He gestured with a broad hand to the other patrons, some of whom were visibly struggling to breathe under the weight of the young man's raw, unfiltered killing intent. It was only then that the young man seemed to notice the effect he was having on the others in the inn. The smirk that had played on his lips faded slightly, and his eyes softened as he surveyed the room. The faces of the patrons were pale, their eyes wide with fear. Some were gripping the edges of their tables, their knuckles white, while others were gasping for breath as if the very air had been stolen from their lungs. For a split second, the young man said nothing. Sigh. Then, with a slow, deliberate breath, he closed his eyes and released the bloodthirst he had been exuding. The effect was immediate. The oppressive weight lifted from the room. The air seemed to clear, and the patrons let out a collective sigh of relief as the pressure on their chests eased. The old man nodded approvingly, his gaze steady as he approached the young man's table. The fear in the room didn't dissipate entirely, but it lessened significantly with the old man's presence, as if his very being was a calming balm against the terror that had just gripped them all. "Thank you," the old man said, his voice kind but with an undertone of sternness, as he turned to look at the Radgar and others. "Leave this place in this instant, you fools. Don't you read the atmosphere?" The old man's voice, though calm, carried an unmistakable authority that sent a shiver down the spines of Radgar and his men. His words were a command, not a suggestion, and the weight of his presence made it clear that defiance was not an option. Radgar, still clutching his wounded arm, felt a surge of humiliation wash over him. He had already been bested by the young traveler, and now this old man was ordering him around as if he were a child. But the pain in his arm, coupled with the oppressive atmosphere that still lingered in the room, sapped any lingering defiance from him. The memory of the bloodthirst that had nearly crushed him was too fresh, too vivid. The others, who had been on the verge of drawing their weapons in a desperate attempt to salvage their pride, suddenly found themselves unable to meet the old man's gaze. Sage. And with a click of their tongue, Radgar turned on his heel and hurried toward the door, his steps uneven as he tried to maintain some semblance of dignity despite his defeat. His men followed suit, their expressions a mix of fear and shame. The bravado that had fueled them earlier was gone, replaced by a desperate need to escape the situation as quickly as possible. The patrons watched in silence as Radgar and his cronies fled the inn, their hurried footsteps echoing in the quiet room. The door swung shut behind them with a finality that seemed to seal their fate, leaving the inn once again in the calm, almost sacred silence that had descended with the old man's arrival. "Tisk, youngster these days," the old man spoke and then walked towards the bar. "Greta, give me a beer," and requested a beer. Chapter 94. A talk? Greta was shaken by all the things that happened there. Was she supposed to be happy, or should she feel fearful? She did not know the answer clearly. Young man. But the moment he appeared at the door, she knew she was in safe hands. "It's better for you to control that bloodthirst. You're suffocating everyone here, not just those fools." The fact that he was here meant things would be more stable from now on. After all, even Radgar or his group would not be able to do anything in his presence, and she hoped the same would hold true for the young man, since he was one of the people she liked and respected a lot. "Greta, give me a beer." Greta nodded as he made his request, the tension that had gripped her beginning to ease. She turned to fetch the beer for the old man, but as she reached for a mug, she suddenly remembered the meal she still needed to prepare for the newcomer. "What do I do?" Her hand hovered over the mug, torn between fulfilling the old man's request and attending to the young man who had so dramatically altered the course of the evening. She glanced between the two men, her hesitation evident in her eyes. The old man, who had been a source of comfort and authority, and the young traveler, whose presence still lingered like a shadow over the room. Greta's mind raced, trying to decide who to prioritize, not wanting to slight either of them. The old man, being perceptive, noticed her dilemma immediately. He gave a soft chuckle and waved his hand dismissively, his fatherly smile returning. "It's fine, Greta," he said gently. "Go on and get that young man his meal first. I can wait. I'll take my beer from Marin." He nodded toward the other bartender, Marin, who was wiping down the counter nearby. Marin, a burly man with a gruff exterior but a kind heart, caught his gaze and gave a quick nod of understanding. Relieved, Greta smiled gratefully at Harlan. "Thank you, Uncle Harlan. I'll be right back with your beer after I take care of this." Harlan waved her off again, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "No rush, my dear. Take your time." With that, Greta turned and quickly made her way to the kitchen, her steps lightened by the old man's understanding. She busied herself with preparing the meal for the young traveler, her hands moving with practiced ease as she put together a hearty plate of roasted meat, fresh bread, and vegetables. All the while, her mind lingered on the events of the evening, the contrast between the men who had shaped it so profoundly, one with calm wisdom, the other with a dangerous edge. As she plated the meal and carried it back to the main room, Greta's thoughts drifted back to the young man. Who was he, really? And what had brought him to Rakenshore? She couldn't help but wonder if there was more to his story, something deeper that had yet to be revealed. When she approached the young traveler's table, she placed the meal in front of him with a smile. "Here you go, sir," she said softly. "I hope it's to your liking." The young man looked up at her, his expression softening for the first time that evening. "Thank you," he replied, his voice quiet but sincere. He glanced at the plate before him, then back at Greta. "I hope you are relieved now." Greta blinked, taken aback by the young man's words. How could he know? This was something she had kept hidden, something that most outsiders wouldn't notice, especially not someone just passing through. Her surprise must have shown on her face because the young man's expression softened further, and a hint of regret flickered in his dark eyes. "Relieved," she repeated, her voice a little shaky as she tried to process what he had just said. The young man nodded, his gaze steady and kind in a way that contrasted sharply with the fierce presence he had exuded earlier. Yes, those men. They've been giving you a hard time, haven't they? Greta's breath caught in her throat. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words seemed to stick, her mind racing to make sense of the situation. She had grown so accustomed to hiding her discomfort, to putting on a brave face for the sake of her family and the patrons, that hearing someone acknowledge her suffering so plainly was both shocking and oddly comforting. "How did you know?" she finally managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. She felt exposed, as if he had seen right through her carefully constructed facade. Greta's breath hitched as the young man's smirk widened, his dark eyes gleaming with a mischievous glint. "I just guessed," he said, his tone light and teasing. "And you confirmed it." Realization dawned on her, and she felt a rush of embarrassment mixed with irritation. He had played her, using her own emotions against her to draw out the truth. She had fallen for his bluff, and now he was clearly enjoying the moment. Greta's cheeks flushed with a mix of anger and humiliation as she stared at him, her earlier gratitude quickly turning into annoyance. "So, this was all a game to you?" she snapped, her voice rising with frustration. "You were just playing around?" The young man's smirk didn't fade. Instead, he raised his hand to his chin, tapping it thoughtfully as if considering her words. "A game," he mused, his tone still light but with a hint of something deeper. "Isn't life just a game where the strong ones are the players?" Greta's irritation faltered, her mind scrambling to find a response. The flippant way he spoke, as if the world and all its hardships could be reduced to something as simple as a game, left her momentarily speechless. She opened her mouth to retort, but the words wouldn't come. The way he said it, so casually, so matter-of-factly, made her question the life she had lived. And being just a countryside girl, she did not know many things as well. So, she could not say anything at all. The young man watched her, his expression still holding that playful edge, but now there was something else there, too, an underlying seriousness that belied his earlier teasing. At least, that was for a split second before his smirk returned. "I'm sorry if I've spoken a bit too deeply," he said, his tone lighter now as if brushing off the weight of his previous words. "It's been a while since I've had a conversation with someone." Before Greta could respond, the cat perched on his shoulder suddenly snarled at him, its eyes narrowing in displeasure. With a quick, sharp swipe, it batted at the young man's head, its tiny claws making contact with his cheek. The sound was more of a warning than a serious attack, but it was clear that the cat was not pleased with him. The young man didn't flinch, though. Instead, he chuckled softly, reaching up to gently scratch the cat behind the ears. All right, I get it," he said, still smiling. "I suppose I should have said I haven't talked with a human for a while?" The cat's snarl faded into a soft purr as it leaned into his touch, clearly appeased by his attention. Greta watched the exchange with a mix of amusement and surprise. The young man's demeanor, which had been so intense just moments before, now seemed almost normal. His interaction with the cat was tender, affectionate, and utterly at odds with the dangerous aura he had exuded earlier. And at the same time, his words, they implied that he had been talking with someone other than a human. Is that a... She stammered, her curiosity and disbelief getting the better of her. The young man's smile widened as he met her gaze, clearly enjoying her reaction. "That's right. She's my contracted familiar," he confirmed, his tone matter-of-fact, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Wow, a contracted familiar, Greta thought inwardly, her mind racing with the implications. Contracted familiars were rare, not just because they required a significant bond between the summoner and the creature, but also because it was rare to find someone awakened with the power to form such a bond in the first place. But as she looked at the cat, who was now purring contentedly under the young man's touch, she couldn't help but feel a pang of confusion. A cat as a contracted familiar, she mused, her thoughts reflecting the surprise she felt. From what little she knew, familiars were often depicted as more ferocious or mystical creatures, beasts of power that matched the strength of their masters. She had heard stories of mighty wolves, fierce eagles, and even serpents with scales as hard as steel. But a cat? It was unexpected, to say the least. The young man seemed to sense her thoughts, his grin turning slightly teasing as he continued to scratch the cat's ears. "Not what you expected, huh?" he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "I suppose you were thinking of something more intimidating?" Greta nodded, unable to keep her thoughts from spilling out. "I've just never seen a contracted familiar like her before. The stories I've heard, they usually talk about fierce beasts, not cats." The young man chuckled softly, clearly entertained by her reaction. "True, most people expect something more dramatic. But don't let her appearance fool you." He glanced at the cat, who had now settled comfortably on his shoulder, her eyes half closed in contentment. "She's far more than meets the eye." Greta tilted her head, intrigued by his words. "Really? What can she do? You would not want to see." She imagined this small cat storming through the battlefield with her tiny structure, and for some reason she could not do so. PFFF. She could only laugh slightly. "You should keep doing that." "Doing what?" "Smile. You are beautiful when you smile." Chapter 95. A talk? 2. Smile. You are beautiful when you smile. Greta's cheeks flushed a deep shade of red at the young man's words, the compliment catching her completely off guard. She wasn't used to hearing such things, especially not from someone like him. The way he said it, so casually yet sincerely, left her momentarily speechless. She lowered her gaze, suddenly feeling shy and self-conscious, the warmth of the compliment settling in her chest. She had received compliments before, remarks on her hard work, her kindness, even her looks, but none had made her feel quite like this. It was as if he had seen something in her that she hadn't even noticed in herself, and that thought both flattered and embarrassed her. After a moment, she gathered the courage to look back up at him, intending to thank him or say something, anything, to acknowledge the compliment. But when she raised her head, she found that he had already turned his attention back to his meal, his focus now entirely on the food before him, as if the conversation had never happened. The ease with which he had shifted his attention only added to her confusion. For him, it seemed, the compliment had been nothing more than a simple, honest observation delivered without any expectation of a response. And now, he was back to being the mysterious traveler, with his enigmatic air and his unusual familiar. Greta stood there for a moment longer, her mind a whirl of thoughts and emotions, before she finally turned away, a small smile playing on her lips despite herself. His words lingered in her mind, making her feel lighter and more confident, and she couldn't help but replay them over and over as she went about her tasks. I could feel Vitalyara's sharp gaze on me as I picked up my fork, her tail flicking with barely concealed irritation. You did it on purpose, didn't you?" she accused, her voice echoing in my mind with a mix of exasperation and amusement. I didn't bother hiding my smirk as I cut into the roasted meat. "What are you talking about?" I asked innocently, not bothering to look at her. "You know what I'm talking about," she shot back, her tone carrying the distinct air of someone who was used to my antics. "Complimenting that girl like that. You enjoyed watching her squirm, didn't you?" I chuckled softly, savoring the tender meat as I chewed. "Perhaps. But can you blame me? People are always so honest when they're caught off guard." "It's fascinating." Vitalyara let out a huff, her tiny paws pressing lightly on my shoulder as she leaned closer, her presence warm against my skin. "You're hopeless, you know that? You could have just let the poor girl be. But no, you had to go and make her blush." "She needed it," I replied, my tone softening slightly. "You saw how tense she was. A little kindness goes a long way, especially for someone who's been dealing with men like those." Vitalyara paused, her irritation fading as she considered my words. "True," she admitted, her tone more thoughtful now. "But still, you didn't have to toy with her emotions like that." "It wasn't my intention to toy with her," I said, pushing my plate slightly to the side as I took a sip of water. "She's been through a lot, and sometimes a simple compliment can do wonders. Besides," I glanced at Greta, who was now busy behind the bar, her cheeks still faintly pink. "She deserved to know that she's more than just a caretaker in this place." She's stronger than she realizes. Vitaliera was silent for a moment, her gaze shifting between Greta and me. Do you really mean that, don't you? I nodded, my expression serious. I do. People like her, they're the backbone of places like this. They keep things running, even when the world around them is falling apart. It's easy to overlook that strength, but it's there. I still remember that time when I was in the army. At that time, Clara also got hit a lot, and there were many men who wanted to be with her. At that time, I knew she had it hard since when she was just a non-awakened woman, she constantly needed to be on alert. Sigh, then, remembering that somehow made me reminisce about the past. However, it was far long gone. In any case, since I knew what kind of hardships people like this girl faced, I decided to give a little help that I couldn't at that time. That was it. But why did you enter like that? Everyone looked at you like some sort of monster. I just wanted to look cool. Here, I thought. What? You thought what? Nothing. It is a man's romance to do such things, you know. Vitaliera tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing as if she were considering something deeply. You know, Gerald had his share of antics like that, too. I suppose this really is a men's thing. I couldn't help but chuckle at her comment. It's a universal truth, I said, nodding in agreement. Every man, given the right situation, would act the same way. There's something about making an entrance, especially when it means standing up for someone who can't do it themselves. Vitaliera let out a soft purr, her earlier amusement returning. I guess I'll never fully understand it, but as long as you're not causing too much trouble, I'll tolerate it. I grinned, feeling a sense of camaraderie in our shared moment. I'll try not to overdo it, I promised, though we both knew that was unlikely. There was something satisfying about those moments, where I could combine a bit of theatrics with a genuine desire to help. It wasn't just about looking cool. It was about making a statement, about showing strength in a way that words alone couldn't convey. With that, I returned to my meal, savoring each bite. It had been far too long since I'd had a proper, cooked meal like this, and I could feel the warmth spreading through me as I ate. The flavors were rich and comforting, a stark contrast to the rations I'd been surviving on for so long. There was a simple pleasure in this, something grounding about sitting in a warm inn, eating good food, and bantering with Vitaliera. For a moment, it almost felt like the world outside didn't exist, that there was no looming danger, no need to keep moving, just the present moment. As I ate, I glanced around the room, noticing how the tension had eased. The patrons were gradually returning to their conversations, though they still shot the occasional glance my way. But the fear was gone, replaced by a cautious curiosity. It seemed that the old man's presence had done wonders to calm the atmosphere, and I was grateful for that. Enjoying yourself? Vitaliera asked, her tone light as she sensed my contentment. I am, I admitted, taking another bite of the roasted meat. It's been too long since I've had a meal like this. I almost forgot what real food tastes like. Then savor it, she replied, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction. You've earned it. I nodded, saying, that is my intention, and then continued eating. As I continued eating, savoring each bite, Vitaliera's voice cut through my thoughts. You know, that girl been throwing you some quick glances for a while now. Seems like she really liked you. I glanced over at the bar, catching Greta's gaze just as she quickly looked away, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. A small, amused smile tugged at the corner of my lips. It's nothing, I said, my tone light. Just a momentary thing. She'll forget about it soon enough. Will she? Vitaliera mused, her tone teasing. Humans have a funny way of holding on to things, especially when it comes to matters of the heart. I chuckled softly, shaking my head. It's not like that. Besides, you do know my circumstances. Yeah. Vitaliera didn't press the matter further, instead shifting to a more serious topic. But what about those men? How do you plan to deal with them? The question brought a chill to my demeanor, and I felt my expression harden. My eyes grew cold as I thought about that guy and his cronies. This world is what it is, I replied quietly, the warmth from earlier fading from my voice. If I kill them here, another group just like them will take their place. The problem isn't with individuals like them. It's with the lack of a governing force in this city. I took another bite of food, chewing thoughtfully before continuing. But that's changing. The war is finished, and soon this territory will become more stable. The power vacuum that allowed people like Radgar to thrive will be filled, and order will be restored, and you're not interested in bullying the weak for no reason, she added, more a statement than a question. Exactly, I said, smiling at the fact that she knew me well. I am only interested in strong people, I mumbled, though that is under the pretense of no reason. Yeah, if you want to rise in the ranks, you need to be ruthless. What do you think the master would have done? Gerald? He would have killed them, most likely. Really? Yeah, he was not that gentle when he was young, let's say. I will take that as a compliment. Vitaliera paused, her curiosity piqued. Then what do you plan to do now? She asked, her tone expectant. I took a final sip of water, savoring the calm before the next step. What else? I replied with a slight grin. I'm going to get a new weapon, of course. Vitaliera tilted her head, a hint of skepticism in her voice. In this small city? How will you find a blacksmith here? I couldn't help but chuckle at her doubt. How will I find one, huh? I said, leaning back in my chair with a satisfied smile. I've already met him. After all, there was a reason I came to this city out of all. Chapter 96. Harlan. When I first picked up Shattered Innocence, it was just to pass the time. The story was ongoing, with plots and subplots unfolding in every corner of its world, characters thrown into chaos, and a complex web of alliances and betrayals. I found myself reading it at a rapid pace, devouring chapter after chapter. But despite my speed, I wasn't just skimming through the pages. I paid attention to the details, every little thing that the author weaved into the story, the hints dropped, the subtle foreshadowing that would later come to fruition. The cast of characters was massive, each with their own quirks, backstories, and motivations. Some were easy to overlook, but others, well, they had a certain spark. They were the ones that stood out, the ones that kept me hooked even when the plot seemed to be dragging. One character in particular caught my interest early on, a blacksmith. He wasn't one of the main characters, not by a long shot, but there was something about him that made him more than just a background figure. The way he was described and the depth of his character, despite his limited appearances, all hinted at something more. The blacksmith wasn't just a simple artisan hammering away at metal. He had a past, a story that was hinted at but never fully revealed. His presence in the story was subtle, but the impact he had on the characters and the plot was undeniable. The weapons he forged weren't just tools. They were extensions of the people who wielded them, imbued with his craftsmanship and a touch of something almost mystical. I found myself intrigued by him, eager to see how he would influence the events to come. And it wasn't just about the weapons he made. There was a wisdom to his character, a depth that suggested he knew far more than he let on. Every interaction he had with the main cast felt significant, as if he was guiding them in ways they didn't even realize. In a way, he was similar to Master. At the very least, the influence he had on me was very similar to the influence he had on the main cast. Though his past was not fully revealed, I remembered a certain phrase. It was something that caught my attention. I've seen my fair share of battles. Spent some time in a border city, a place that was struggling to keep its head above water because of the war. The Valerius Plains weren't kind to anyone, and Rakenshore, well, it was one of the hardest hit. That phrase had stuck with me even though it was just a brief mention, a passing comment in a larger conversation. The blacksmith didn't delve into the details of his time there. He rarely spoke about his past in any depth, but the way he said it, the way his voice softened, and his gaze grew distant, it was clear that the experience had left its mark on him. Rakenshore. The name had seemed so insignificant at the time, just another place in a world ravaged by conflict. At least for a reader, that could be explained in a way that is easy. But for me, who was now a citizen of this world and someone who had deserted from the battlefield, that phrase contained a meaning. Or a clue. There is a high chance that the blacksmith is in that city. That was the primary reason why my first direction was this city. Since it was close to the border, it did not take too long for me to reach this place. After all, it was close to the border, and so was I. It was even shown on the map that Elias had left behind. The city seems to be a very old one. In any case, that old man who had appeared out of nowhere, his presence commanding the room with an effortless authority. It had to be him. Harlan. It was him. The blacksmith. I couldn't help but smile to myself. It was almost surreal. I had come here with a purpose, and now that purpose was within reach. There was still much to do, much to learn, but the first step had been taken. You seem pretty satisfied with yourself, Vitaliera commented, her voice laced with amusement. I am, I admitted, my tone reflecting the satisfaction I felt. I found him, the blacksmith, she guessed, her keen intuition piecing together my thoughts. I nodded, my gaze still fixed on Harlan. Yes. And now, it's time to see if he's willing to help. Vitaliera purred in approval, her tiny paws shifting slightly on my shoulder. Then let's get to work. You've made it this far, Lucavian. Don't let this opportunity slip away. She did not even question how I knew Harlan was here, though if she were to ask, the only answer I could give to her would be that someone told me. Finishing the last of my meal, I pushed the plate aside and stood up, my movements deliberate and calm. I could feel Harlan's gaze on me as I approached the bar, but he didn't speak right away. Instead, he watched me with those wise, knowing eyes, the kind that had seen much and understood even more. When I reached the bar, I nodded to him in greeting. Old man, I said, keeping my voice low and respectful. The old man raised an eyebrow, clearly curious about what I was going to say next. Yes, young man? What can I do for you? I took a deep breath, meeting his gaze with unwavering resolve. I'm looking for a blacksmith. I believe you're the one I've been searching for. For a moment, Harlan's expression didn't change. At least that was how it looked. However, I could see that a small pressure was emanating from him. Then, slowly, a small smile tugged at the corners of his lips, and he let out a soft chuckle. Is that so? He said, his tone carrying a note of intrigue. And what makes you think I'm the one you're looking for? Just a hunch, I replied, keeping my tone light, though my gaze was unwavering as I met Harlan's eyes. The old man's smile didn't falter, but I felt the subtle shift in the air, the pressure that seemed to radiate from him growing slightly heavier. Well, your hunch is wrong then, he said with a casual wave of his hand. I'm no blacksmith and certainly not the person you're looking for. I didn't react immediately, letting the silence stretch between us. Instead, I held his gaze, searching for something, anything, that would betray his words as false. It was a gamble, a shot in the dark, but I had a feeling I wasn't entirely off the mark. After a few moments, I leaned in slightly, my voice lowering to a near whisper. If that's what you wish to say, that's fine. But I paused, letting my words hang in the air for a heartbeat longer. It would be quite unfortunate if word got out that the legendary blacksmith who once forged the holy sword was staying here in Rakenshore. Wouldn't it? The effect was immediate. The easygoing smile that had graced Harlan's face vanished in an instant, replaced by an expression of cold, steely focus. The subtle pressure I had felt earlier now intensified, wrapping around me like a vice, and for a brief moment, I felt the weight of his presence. A presence that spoke of countless battles and an unmatched skill in the craft of war. Harlan's eyes, which had been warm and fatherly, now bore into mine with an intensity that made it clear I had struck a nerve. You're playing a dangerous game, boy, he said, his voice low and edged with a warning. You might not like where it leads. I didn't flinch under his gaze. Instead, I met his intensity with my own, refusing to back down. I'm not looking for trouble, I said, my tone steady. I'm looking for the best. And if you're the blacksmith I think you are, then you're exactly who I need. Harlan held my gaze for a long moment, the tension between us thick and palpable. Then, slowly, the pressure began to ease, and the stern expression on his face softened just slightly. You're persistent, he finally said, his voice carrying a hint of reluctant admiration. I'll give you that. But persistence alone doesn't forge a blade, young man. I nodded, understanding the weight of his words. I'm willing to prove myself, I replied. Whatever it takes. I didn't come all this way just to turn back now. Harlan studied me for a few more seconds, then let out a long sigh as if conceding to something he had been resisting. You've got guts, he muttered more to himself than to me. But guts don't guarantee skill. He straightened, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Something like respect. Very well, he said, his voice firm. We'll see if you're worth my time. But be warned. If you fail, I won't waste another second on you. Understood, I replied, feeling a surge of determination. Harlan's expression softened just a bit, and the faintest hint of a smile returned to his lips. Then let's get to work, he said while standing up. Add it to my tab. Got it. And then he turned to look at me. Come boy. What are you waiting for? I got caught off guard by his rapid decision, but it was not an unwelcome one. Okay, since it was the display of skills. I was confident. Chapter 97. Harlan, 2. Harlan led the way out of the inn, his stride purposeful and brisk, leaving me to follow in his wake. The old man moved with a surprising energy, given his age, and I found myself quickening my pace to keep up with him. We walked through the narrow streets of Rackenshaw, passing by buildings that had seen better days. The city bore the scars of war, cracked walls, broken windows, and a general air of weariness. But there was also a sense of resilience here, a determination to rebuild and carry on despite the hardships. It was fitting. I thought that a blacksmith like Harlan would choose to remain in a place like this. Eventually, we reached a small, nondescript building tucked away at the edge of town. The sign above the door was faded and nearly illegible, but there was no mistaking the sound of metal being worked inside. The rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil echoed faintly through the air, a sound that spoke of countless hours of labor and skill. Harlan pushed open the door and stepped inside, gesturing for me to follow. The interior of the smithy was dimly lit, the walls lined with tools and racks of old weapons, many of them covered in a fine layer of dust. The forge at the back of the room glowed faintly with embers, the heat radiating outward and filling the space with a dry warmth. The weapons scattered on the ground were a mix of swords, axes, and spears, all in various states of disrepair. Some were rusted, their edges dulled by time, while others were chipped or bent, the remnants of battles long past. Harlan walked over to one of the piles and picked up a sword, its blade pitted and rusty. He held it up, inspecting it for a moment before turning to face me. The sword was nothing special, a simple, single-edged blade with a worn hilt, but the way Harlan held it made it clear that he knew exactly how to use it. Without a word, he pointed the sword at me, his eyes narrowing. Come at me, he said, his voice gruff and commanding. I blinked, taken aback by the sudden challenge. Are you serious? I asked, my hand instinctively moving toward the hilt of my own sword. Harlan's expression didn't change. Don't make me repeat myself. Boy, he growled, his tone leaving no room for argument. Is that so? Harlan's challenge hung in the air, the tension between us thick and charged. My hand gripped the hilt of my estoc as I drew it in one smooth motion, the blade glinting faintly in the dim light of the smithy. Harlan's eyes, sharp and calculating, never left mine as he held the rusty sword with an air of familiarity that hinted at years of experience. There was no hesitation in his movements, no sign of age slowing him down. Despite his weathered appearance, the old man exuded a strength and presence that belied his years. It was clear that Harlan was not someone to be taken lightly. Swoosh! Without warning, Harlan lunged forward, his rusty blade cutting through the air with surprising speed. I barely had time to react, bringing my estoc up to parry the blow. Indeed, not a weak one. The force of his strike reverberated through my arm, and I realized just how strong he was. This wasn't going to be an easy test. I pushed back against his blade, creating a momentary distance between us. Harlan didn't give me time to catch my breath, following up with a series of rapid strikes that forced me on the defensive. His movements were precise, each swing of his sword calculated to keep me off balance. Despite the worn state of his weapon, Harlan wielded it with deadly efficiency. I shifted my stance, relying on my speed and agility to evade his attacks. My S-stock, designed for thrusts and quick strikes, found its mark as I aimed for the openings in Harlan's defenses. But each time I thought I had an advantage, the old man countered with a move that forced me to reassess my approach. This crafty old man. He is using his strength advantage. While I may have been improving myself quite well just from the first clash alone, I could see that Harlan was someone who was stronger than me in terms of raw power. It became clear that Harlan was testing me, pushing me to see how I would react under pressure. His strikes grew heavier, and I could feel the weight of his experience behind each blow. But as the battle wore on, something clicked within me. I can see it, the blade, the style. While it may not be easy for a good swordsman, for someone like Harlan, who was rather using his raw strength, it was not that hard to assess his swordsmanship and decipher it. I began to see the patterns in his attacks, the subtle shifts in his stance that telegraphed his next move. I adjusted my own movements, and my strikes became more focused and efficient. With each exchange, I matched Harlan's strength with my skill, the clash of our blades echoing through the smithy. Clank! My S-stock darted forward, aimed at the gaps in his defense, and I could feel the momentum shifting in my favor. Harlan's eyes narrowed as he recognized the change, but he didn't slow down. If anything, he became more aggressive, testing the limits of my abilities. Clank! Swoosh! But in the end, it came down to one single swing. Thud! One single swing made the blade fly and hit the ground. How was it? I asked with my breath slightly fast. Slightly. Harlan's eyes slowly shifted downward to the blade hovering just below his chin. The S-stock's tip was steady, mere inches from his weathered skin. I expected him to acknowledge my victory, maybe even offer a begrudging nod of respect. But instead, his face twisted into a frown, deep lines of disappointment etching across his features. He remained silent for a long moment, the weight of his gaze fixed on the blade. My breath came in shallow bursts, the adrenaline from our clash still coursing through my veins. Yet, as the seconds ticked by, the satisfaction I'd felt moments ago began to wane, replaced by a growing unease. Finally, Harlan let out a low, rumbling sigh. His frown deepened as he slowly reached up and, with a firm yet deliberate motion, pushed the tip of my S-stock away from his throat. The blade scraped lightly against the calloused skin of his palm before falling to his side. I lowered my weapon, confusion gnawing at me. "What's wrong?" I asked. Harlan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he bent down, retrieving the rusty sword I'd disarmed from him. He turned it over in his hands, inspecting the edge with a critical eye as if the fault lay not in my performance but in the weapon itself. After what felt like an eternity, he finally looked up, his eyes meeting mine with a mix of frustration and something else, something I couldn't quite place. "You've got skill, lad," he said, his voice rough and low, like gravel being ground beneath a heavy boot. "But skill alone isn't enough." I blinked, taken aback. "I don't understand. What was that supposed to mean? Skill alone is not enough?" Harlan's eyes bore into mine, his frown deepening as he continued. "You fight well, lad. Damn well. Like someone who's seen life and death more times than they care to remember." I felt a strange mixture of pride and confusion at his words. I wanted to thank him and acknowledge the compliment, but something in his tone made me hesitate. There was an edge to his voice, a warning that cut through the praise. "But that's precisely the problem," Harlan added, his voice growing harsher, like the grating of steel against stone. "You're skilled, no doubt about that. You wield that blade with lethal precision. Every slash, every strike, you know how to kill. Your blade moves with purpose, and you've honed that purpose into something deadly." He took a step closer, his gaze narrowing as he studied me, searching for something deeper. "But that's what makes you terrifying, boy. That's why you're dangerous." I blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift in his tone. "Dangerous?" I echoed the word, hanging heavy in the air between us. Harlan nodded slowly, his expression grave. Dangerous, like a wild beast. You fight with the intent to kill, with the bloodlust that you don't even try to hide." It was there, clear as day, when you disarmed me. You're not just fighting to win, you're fighting to end your opponent. And that's what makes you like a beast, boy. He paused, his eyes never leaving mine, and I felt the weight of his words settling on my shoulders. Your weapon, he continued, is a graceful one. An estoc is a blade of precision, of finesse. It's meant for thrusting, for finding the gaps in armor, for striking with elegance. But the way you fight, it's anything but graceful. You wield that blade like a beast, all raw power and bloodlust. There's no balance, no harmony between you and your weapon. It's as if the sword itself is screaming against the way you use it. Somehow, while his words looked weird, they felt true. That is why, no matter how good your sword is, in your hands it will not last long. And I refuse to create a weapon that is tied to such a fate. It seemed I was still lacking. Chapter 98. Harlan 3. Harlan's voice softened, though his gaze remained stern. There's more to wielding a blade than just knowing how to kill. A true swordsman understands the balance between power and grace, between the blade and the hand that guides it. You've got the skill, boy, but you lack the understanding. You're letting the beast inside you control the sword rather than mastering the beast and letting the sword become an extension of yourself. Mastering the beast inside me? The moment I heard about this, I suddenly thought of the past. They were fragments, fleeting images of a time when everything was simpler yet far more complicated. When I first picked the weapon and my master started teaching me, he also mentioned the same thing. You are smiling when you fight. He had watched me with those sharp, discerning eyes of his, and I remember the day he spoke to me about it. // // // // // // // It was a clear afternoon, the sun casting long shadows over the training grounds. I stood before him, clutching a wooden practice sword, my young heart pounding with excitement and something else, something darker. Master had approached me, his expression unreadable, but there was a seriousness in his gaze that made me stand a little straighter, my grip tightening on the hilt. Kid, he had said, his voice calm yet firm. There's something you need to understand about the path you're choosing. The sword is more than just a weapon. It's a reflection of the soul that wields it. I had frowned, not fully grasping his meaning at the time. To me, the sword was something that I meant to use, something that was an extension of mine. But Master had seen beyond my naive understanding. He had seen the beast lurking within me, the raw, untamed hunger that drove me to pick up the blade with such fervor. There's a beast inside you, he had continued, his eyes never leaving mine. It's different from the ones in others. Yours is different, you do not seek simple strength. Having strength will not satisfy you. His words struck a chord within me, a truth I hadn't fully acknowledged. I had always thought that my desire to grow stronger was like everyone else's, a natural drive to protect myself. But Master was right. There was something deeper, something more consuming. You want more than just strength, Master said, his voice carrying a weight that made my heart pound. You want to clash blades. You want to converse with your blade rather than with words. Every swing, every thrust. It's like you're speaking through your sword, revealing all the things you've buried deep inside. His words felt like he was pulling back the layers of my soul, exposing the raw truth that I had tried to keep hidden, even from myself. The blade wasn't just a tool for me. It was a voice, a way to express the emotions and thoughts I couldn't put into words. The thrill of battle, the connection between two warriors clashing with all they had. That was where I felt truly alive. But there's a danger in that, Master had said, his tone growing somber. When you speak through your blade, you're opening yourself up, laying bare your soul. And in that thrill, in that moment of connection, you start to lose yourself. The beast inside you takes over, driving you to fight harder, faster, more recklessly. It's not just about winning or losing. It's about the rush, the feeling of being fully alive in that moment. Of course, before he could talk to me further, he left this world, leaving me still pondering what he meant by that. And still, I had yet to find the correct balance. / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / As the memory faded, I found myself back in Harlan's smithy, the echoes of my master's words still ringing in my ears. Harlan was right. The way I fought was raw, unrefined, driven by a hunger that wasn't entirely my own. I needed to find a way to bring balance between that primal urge and the precision my weapon demanded. Mastering the beast inside me, I muttered under my breath, the resolve hardening within me. It was a journey I had begun long ago, but one I had yet to truly understand. Harlan, still watching me closely, seemed to recognize the shift in my demeanor. "You've got the skill," he repeated, his voice softer now. "But skill without control is like a sword without a hilt. It'll cut you just as easily as it'll cut your enemy. Remember that." Vital Yara's voice echoed in my mind, her tone calm but laced with concern. "I didn't say anything before because it wasn't detrimental, but you change when you hold the sword, Lucavian. There's something different about you, something that even I can sense." I frowned slightly, her words striking a chord with the thoughts that had been swirling in my mind ever since Harlan's harsh critique. "You've noticed it too?" I asked quietly, glancing at the estoc in my hand. "Of course I have," she replied, her voice gentle. "You become sharper, more focused, but also more distant. It's like you're letting something else take over, something that's not entirely you. It worries me." I let out a slow breath, the weight of her observation pressing down on me. "What do I need to do?" I asked, turning my gaze back to Harlan. "To make you forge a weapon for me? One that can help me master this beast inside." Harlan looked at me for a long moment, his eyes studying me with a depth that made me feel exposed, as if he could see every flaw, every doubt within me. Then, his gaze dropped to the estoc in my hand, his expression hardening slightly. "The blade you're holding now," Harlan said, his voice gruff but steady, "it's on its last breath. You've pushed it far beyond what it was meant to endure. If you want me to forge a weapon for you, I need you to prove that you can control yourself. Control that beast." I nodded, my grip tightening on the hilt of my estoc. "How?" Harlan's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "There's a group of bandits that have been causing trouble around these parts. They've taken advantage of the war and the lack of order, and they've been terrorizing the nearby villages. Clear them out. But here's the catch. You have to do it with the blade you're holding now. If it remains intact by the time you're done, you will get your new weapon." But while he was saying that, his last words caught my attention. "If I succeed, I will get my new weapon?" Harlan's smile widened, a glint of something almost playful in his eyes. "If you succeed, you'll get your weapon. But I get the payment up front." "Payment up front?" I echoed, confused. Harlan's eyes sparkled with knowing amusement as he saw the confusion on my face. "Indeed. Spill what you have. The materials." I hesitated for a moment before asking, "How did you know?" Harlan chuckled, his rough voice carrying a hint of warmth. "I've seen far too many people like you before, lad. That gleam in your eye, the excitement you're trying to hide. It's the same look every swordsman gets when they've found something precious. It's as clear as day. You wouldn't be so eager for a new weapon unless you had the materials to make it worth my while." A sigh escaped my lips as I realized how transparent I must have seemed to him. It was as if I was a child in front of this old man, someone who had seen and done far more than I could imagine. The feeling was oddly familiar, reminiscent of my time with Master, though there was a subtle difference. At that time, when I was with Master, I was really a kid. A faint smile tugged at the corners of my mouth as I reached into the small pouch at my side. "I suppose there's no point in hiding it then," I said, pulling out a handful of rare, gleaming scales that I had gathered. Harlan's eyes lingered on the scales I handed him, the gleaming surface reflecting the dim light of the forge. He ran his fingers over the rough texture, his expression a mix of admiration and surprise. "The scales of an abyssal wyrm. No, these are from a lesser one," he said, his voice carrying a note of recognition. "You hunted this beast yourself?" I met his gaze evenly, nodding. "I did." For a moment, there was silence as Harlan studied me, his eyes narrowing slightly. The weight of his scrutiny was palpable, as if he was trying to see through me and understand what kind of person would challenge such a creature at my age. He finally let out a low, impressed whistle. Only someone like you would have the guts to take on a beast like that at your age. Most would run from a lesser abyssal WIRM, not seek it out. A smirk tugged at my lips, the corners curling up just slightly. I'm a beast myself, after all. Harlan chuckled, a deep, rough sound that echoed through the smithy. It's good that you know yourself, he said, a gleam of respect in his eyes. Most people spend their whole lives trying to figure out who they are. You've already got that part down. I shrugged, the weight of his words settling on me. It's something I've had to learn, whether I wanted to or not. Harlan's gaze softened slightly, the gruffness in his demeanor easing just a bit. You're young, but you've been through a lot, haven't you? That kind of experience. It shapes a man for better or worse. His words struck a chord within me, a reminder of the battles I had fought, the lives I had taken, and the scars, both visible and invisible, that I carried with me. It's made me who I am, I replied quietly, the truth of it echoing in my heart. Harlan nodded as if understanding more than he let on. Well, lad, you've got the spirit and the skills. But remember, a good weapon isn't just about what it can do. It's about the bond between the blade and the wielder. If you can keep that sword intact while clearing out those bandits, you'll have earned yourself a weapon that will be with you for life. If the blade is not enough, at some point, I doubted that a blade made from the scales of a peak rank 3 monster could endure that much in the future. Then it is the blade's fault, not yours. Just focus on yourself for now, kid. You may not see the blade yourself. Haha, that is right. He gave the scales one last look before setting them aside with care. I'll start preparing the forge. You focus on the task ahead. But don't forget, this isn't just a test of your strength. It's a test of who you are. I nodded, the weight of his words settling on my shoulders. I understand. As I turned to leave the smithy, I somehow felt a little fulfilled. Let's rest now. It has been a while since I stayed in an inn. Thankfully, I had some money from Empire in the pouch. Something that could last me for a little while. Chapter 99. Rest. I made my way back to the inn, my mind still buzzing with the conversation I'd had with Harlan. The smithy's warmth lingered on my skin, but the cool evening air quickly chased it away as I walked through the narrow streets of Rakenshore. The city was beginning to come alive again after the lull of the afternoon, with people slowly returning to their homes, eager to escape the dangers that lurked in the dark corners of the world. When I reached the inn, I could hear the murmur of voices and the clatter of dishes before I even stepped through the door. The place was busier now, the earlier tension that had filled the air seemingly forgotten as the patrons relaxed into their routines. The scent of cooked food and ale wafted out, mingling with the faint smell of smoke from the hearth. Pushing open the door, I stepped inside, the warm atmosphere of the tavern washing over me. The inn was indeed more crowded than before, with more people seated at the tables, enjoying their meals or talking in low voices. The earlier incident with Radgar and his men seemed like a distant memory now, though I noticed a few wary glances thrown my way as I entered. I ignored them, making my way to an empty table near the corner. The familiarity of the place was comforting, a stark contrast to the unknowns that awaited me in the coming days. The girl, Greta, noticed me as I sat down, and I saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes. She seemed surprised to see me back so soon but quickly composed herself, giving me a small nod before returning to her duties. I leaned back in my chair, letting the hum of conversation wash over me. The room was alive with the sounds of clinking glasses, murmured conversations, and the occasional burst of laughter. It was a stark contrast to the quiet intensity of the smithy, but in its own way, it was just as comforting. I could go and get my new room right away, but it had been a while since I was in such a crowded place. The months that I had spent in the forest somehow made me yearn for the presence of humans around me for a little. That is why I decided to stay here a little bit. As I sat there, I couldn't help but think about what Harlan had said. Harness the beast inside you. How am I going to do that? It was a question that I would need to ponder for a while. The bandits wouldn't be easy to deal with, especially if I had to preserve the integrity of my blade. But I welcomed the challenge. It was a chance to push myself, to see just how far I could go, and to gain something more than just a new weapon. As the night wore on, the inn gradually began to quiet down, the patrons finishing their meals and drifting off to their rooms. I remained at my table, lost in thought, until Greta approached with a warm smile. "Would you like a room for the night, sir?" she asked, her voice gentle and polite. "Yes, please," I replied, nodding. Greta gave a small nod of understanding and handed me a key. "Rooms upstairs, third on the left. It's not much, but it should be comfortable enough." "Thank you," I said, taking the key from her hand. She hesitated for a moment as if she wanted to say something else, but then decided against it. "If you need anything, just let me know." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving me to my thoughts once more. As Greta walked away, Vital Yara's voice piped up in my mind, her tone laced with amusement. "She probably wanted to spend the night with you, you know?" I shook my head, a small smile tugging at my lips. "No, I don't think that's the case." "Joe? And why not?" Vitaliera asked, curiosity evident in her voice. She seemed rather hesitant, as if she wanted to say something more. "It's just a hunch," I replied, glancing at the key in my hand. But the way she looked at me, it wasn't out of lust or desire. It was something else. Something else. Vital Yara's interest was piqued, and I could feel her attention focused on me as I made my way toward the stairs. "Yes," I nodded, making my way up the creaky wooden steps. Her gaze, it had a certain softness to it. It was almost like she was searching for something, or maybe she just needed reassurance. But it wasn't anything like what you're suggesting. "How can you be sure of this?" "Let's say I have seen my fair share of such looks." "Really?" Vitaliera mused, her tone thoughtful. "Humans can be complicated, can't they? So many emotions wrapped up in a single look." I chuckled softly, reaching the top of the stairs. "That's true. But it's also what makes them interesting." "Well, whatever it was, you handled it well," Vitaliera conceded. "But if she does come knocking at your door tonight, don't say I didn't warn you." I smiled at her playful tone. "If that happens, I'll be sure to thank you for the warning. But for now, let's just focus on getting some rest." With that, I reached my room, the third on the left, as Greta had indicated. The door creaked slightly as I pushed it open, revealing the small, simple space within. I set my belongings down on the table and took a moment to absorb the quiet, peaceful atmosphere of the room. The bed looked inviting, and I felt the day's weariness weighing heavily on me. But as my head hit the pillow and I allowed my thoughts to drift, I knew that for now the best thing I could do was rest, since tomorrow I would most likely need to deal with something. The actions of yesterday did not disappear after all. The morning light filtered through the small window, casting a warm glow across the room as I slowly opened my eyes. The first thing I noticed was the sun's position in the sky, already quite high. "You slept in longer than usual," Vitaliera commented, her tone laced with mild amusement. I stretched, feeling the lingering weariness in my muscles. "I needed it," I replied, my voice still a bit groggy. "After everything that's happened, it's better to let my body rest and recover fully." "Fair enough," she conceded. "But don't make it a habit. We have a lot to do." I smiled at her reminder, swinging my legs over the side of the bed. "Don't worry, I am not lazy." After washing up quickly and gathering my belongings, I made my way downstairs. The inn was quiet, the remnants of last night's activity all but gone. The scent of fresh bread and cooking meat wafted through the air, reminding me that it was indeed morning and the world outside had already begun to stir. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw the owners of the inn bustling about, preparing for the day ahead. The inn girl, Greta, was nowhere to be seen, but there was another woman, older, with a striking resemblance to her. She had the same kind eyes and soft features, though the lines on her face spoke of years of hard work and care. The woman noticed me descending the stairs, and her eyes widened slightly. She hesitated for a moment, a flicker of fear crossing her face, but she quickly composed herself, offering me a polite smile. "Good morning, sir," she greeted me, bowing her head slightly. "Good morning," I replied, nodding in return. The woman's fear was subtle but noticeable, likely due to the events of last night. I didn't blame her. Anyone would be cautious after what had happened. She seemed to sense my understanding and relaxed a bit, her smile becoming more genuine. "I hope you slept well," she added. Her voice warmed despite the slight tension in her posture. "I did, thank you," I replied, glancing around the inn. "You must be Greta's mother?" At the mention of her daughter's name from my mouth, the woman, Elena, made a slightly tense face. Makes sense that they are tense. I may not be an expert at reading the people, but I can see the reason why she did that. Considering that her daughter was targeted by an awakened before, she must have assumed the same would be happening. Though I am not like them, let's not make things uncomfortable. "Is the breakfast ready?" Elena seemed to hesitate for a brief moment, but then she nodded, her smile returning though still tinged with a hint of caution. "Yes, it is. Please have a seat, and I'll bring it right over." I offered her a reassuring smile, hoping to ease the tension. "Thank you. I appreciate it." I chose a seat near the window, where the morning light streamed in, casting a warm glow over the room. The inn was starting to fill with the quiet hum of activity, patrons beginning their day with a meal or a cup of coffee. It was a peaceful scene, a stark contrast to the tension of the night before. As I waited, I glanced around the room, taking in the simple but cozy surroundings. The inn had a rustic charm, with wooden beams overhead and a stone fireplace that added to the warmth. It was a place that had seen its share of hardships but had endured, just like the people who ran it. A few minutes later, Elena returned with a tray in hand. She carefully placed a plate of eggs, bread, and some fruit in front of me, along with a steaming cup of tea. "Here you are, sir," she said with a small smile. "I hope you enjoy it." Normally, I did not like eating sweet things like fruits in the morning, but I decided to give it a try. Maybe something could be different. "Who knew?" "Thank you, miss," I replied, nodding to her. She lingered for a moment, her eyes searching mine as if trying to gauge my intentions. I met her gaze steadily, keeping my expression calm and friendly. Finally, she seemed to relax a little more and gave a slight bow before turning to attend to other guests. As I began to eat, I could feel Vitalyara's presence, her watchful eyes taking in everything around us. "You handled that well," she remarked, her tone approving. "But they will not drop their guard around you. That is fine. In the end, I will leave this place soon anyway. There is no need to overly make things complicated." Creak. Just as I was about to take another bite, the door to the inn burst open with a loud bang, the force of which caused several patrons to jump in their seats. Chapter 100. Again? That is fine. In the end, I will leave this place soon anyway. There is no need to overly make things complicated. Creak. As I was savoring the delicious meal in front of me, the tranquility of the inn was suddenly shattered by the deafening sound of the door bursting open. Startled patrons jumped in their seats, and the previously cheerful morning ambience was replaced by an atmosphere of surprise and curiosity as everyone's attention swiftly shifted toward the entrance. A tall figure stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders filling the frame as he surveyed the room with a look of barely concealed irritation. His clothes were rugged, a mix of leather and worn fabric, and his boots were caked with mud. A heavy, imposing sword hung at his side, its hilt worn from use. The man's face was hard, weathered by years of battle, with a scar running down his left cheek that only added to his menacing appearance. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension palpable as everyone waited to see what this newcomer would do. But they seemed to know this person. They did not show the same reaction that they did to me when I entered, but the fear was still there. His gaze swept over the patrons, lingering on each one as if assessing their worth before finally settling on me. His eyes narrowed, and I could feel the weight of his scrutiny. There was a coldness in his stare, a calculation that suggested he was no stranger to violence. This was a man who had seen his share of battles, and had likely caused more than a few of them himself. Vitalyara's voice whispered in my mind, "Stay alert. This one doesn't look like he's here for a peaceful morning." I noticed, I replied mentally, my hand instinctively drifting toward the hilt of my estoc, which rested by my side. I kept my movements subtle, not wanting to provoke a confrontation unless absolutely necessary. Just as I felt the cold gaze of the scarred man bore into me, I sensed more presence approaching from behind him. A familiar, unwelcome aura seeped into the room, one I had encountered just yesterday. So, they're back for more. Ragnar and his men filed in behind the tall man, their expressions a mix of fear and determination. It was clear they weren't acting on their own volition anymore. Ragnar's eyes flickered with recognition when he spotted me, and a twisted grin spread across his face. There he is, Ragnar sneered, pointing directly at me. That's the one who caused us all that trouble. The moment he spoke, the tall man's gaze hardened further. His cold eyes never left mine as he took a step forward, the sound of his boots echoing ominously through the now silent inn. The patrons who had been quietly eating their breakfast were now frozen in place, their fear palpable. I see, so this is what it is. The tall man moved with a deliberate, almost predatory grace, closing the distance between us until he was standing right in front of me. He was even more imposing up close, his presence radiating an aura of danger and command. He didn't speak at first, merely looking down at me with a disdainful expression. The silence stretched the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. I kept my hand resting lightly on the hilt of my estoc, ready for whatever might come next, but not making any overtly hostile moves. Finally, the tall man broke the silence, his voice low and gravelly. So, you're the one who thought it'd be a good idea to mess with my men? His tone was calm, almost conversational, but there was an unmistakable threat lurking beneath the surface. He leaned in slightly, his scarred face just inches from mine, as if daring me to give him a reason to escalate this encounter. I met his gaze evenly, refusing to be intimidated. Your men were the ones who caused trouble first, I replied, keeping my voice steady. I merely defended myself. A muscle in the man's jaw twitched, and for a brief moment, I saw a flash of something dangerous in his eyes. But he didn't lash out, not yet, anyway. Instead, he straightened up, his expression shifting from contempt to something more calculating. You've got guts, I'll give you that, he said slowly. But you're stepping into dangerous territory, boy. This isn't a place for heroes. You should have kept your head down. His hand rested casually on the hilt of his own sword, a clear warning. Behind him, Ragnar and his men exchanged glances, eager to see how this confrontation would play out. It was obvious they were relying on their leader to exact some sort of revenge for the humiliation they had suffered. I could feel Vital Yara's presence sharpening, her instincts telling me that things could go south at any moment. He's testing you, she whispered, her voice tinged with concern. Be careful. Be careful, huh? There was indeed tension around the room, something that everyone could sense. But I was already expecting such a thing to happen from the start. After all, when confronted, cockroaches like Ragnar tend to hide behind someone stronger. Maybe I should have, I said, my tone even. But then again, I'm not one to back down when challenged. The tall man's lips curled into a faint, humorless smile. Is that so? He glanced over his shoulder at Ragnar, who was watching the exchange with a mixture of anticipation and fear. Seems like my men underestimated you. Ragnar flinched slightly at the indirect rebuke but quickly regained his composure, glaring at me with undisguised malice. The tall man turned his attention back to me, his expression hardening once more. You've got one chance, he said, his voice dropping to a low growl. Apologize for what you did to my men, and maybe I'll let you walk out of here in one piece. Ha! I let out a quiet breath, feeling the tension in the room spike even further. The man was offering me a way out, one that would let me avoid a fight. But it was clear that this was more than just about an apology. It was about dominance, about showing everyone in the room who held the real power here. And this was exactly what I wanted. Mr. Leader, let me ask you something, I said, my voice calm but carrying a weight that demanded attention. The tall man narrowed his eyes at me, clearly not expecting the shift in tone. What is it? he growled, his patience wearing thin. Are you married? I asked, my gaze steady. Or do you have a significant other? The man's brows furrowed in confusion. Significant other? He repeated, the term unfamiliar and odd in this context. He glanced at Ragna, who looked just as puzzled, before turning back to me. What does that have to do with anything? I leaned slightly forward, my voice dropping just enough to draw him in. What if someone were to molest your daughter? I asked, my tone deadly serious. What would you do? The question hung in the air, the atmosphere in the room growing even heavier. The man's eyes darkened, and I could see a flicker of something dangerous behind them. If someone were to molest my daughter, he said slowly, his voice dripping with menace, then that person would no longer be in this world. So you would kill him? I pressed, my gaze never leaving his. Yes, he replied without hesitation, his eyes cold and unforgiving. There was no doubt in his mind, no room for mercy or understanding. The conviction in his voice was chilling, and it was clear that he meant every word. I nodded, acknowledging his response. But what if you weren't strong enough? I continued, my tone unwavering. What if the person who molested your daughter was stronger than you? What would you do then? When asked this, he was not able to give any answer at all at first, as he seemed to be thinking. Something that he is not much accustomed to, the people of such an era, especially those who live in the countryside like this. They are not accustomed to thinking, but when they do, most of them tend to reveal how they were raised. The man's face twisted with thought, his brow furrowing as he processed my words. It was clear that this wasn't something he was used to contemplating. The concept of strength being the ultimate decider was deeply ingrained in him, but the idea of being powerless in the face of greater strength seemed to trouble him. After a moment, he finally spoke, his voice cold and resigned. If that's the case, then I can only blame myself for being weak. I tilted my head slightly, studying him. So, by your logic, the strong are allowed to do anything? Without consequence. That's right, he replied, his eyes hardening as if steeling himself against the implications of his own words. In this world, the strong make the rules. The weak either fall in line or get crushed. I nodded slowly, a faint smile playing at the corners of my lips. Then it seems we're in agreement. That is why I both hated and loved this world at the same time. In this place, if you are strong enough, you can do anything, and if you are weak, you can't. WH-? In that split second, my blade flashed. A quick, precise motion that sliced through the air. Swoosh! The room seemed to freeze, the tension reaching its peak as the patrons watched with bated breath. The man didn't have time to react. His eyes widened in shock as my estoc was already at his throat, the cold steel pressing against his skin. His breath hitched, and I could see the realization dawning in his eyes, that, at this moment, he was at the mercy of someone stronger. The silence in the room was deafening, every eye on us as I held the blade steady, my expression calm and unyielding. I could feel the weight of my words, of the situation, settling over him like a heavy shroud. Then, by your own rules, I said quietly, my voice low and firm, you've lost. Chapter 101. Again? 2. Regardless of what we do in our lives or how we are proven wrong, people often cling to their beliefs. It's a curious thing how the mind works. We can be faced with undeniable proof, yet we find ways to justify our actions and mold reality to fit our narrative. It's a stubbornness rooted deep within us, a refusal to admit that we might have been wrong. Then, by your own rules, you've lost. Take this man, for example. Even now, with my blade at his throat, I could see the wheels turning in his mind, searching for a way to reconcile what just happened with the worldview he's held onto for so long. In his world, strength is everything. But what happens when that strength is challenged? When it's shown to be insufficient? The truth is, most people don't change. They double down, holding on to their beliefs even tighter because to admit they're wrong would be to admit weakness. And in a world like this, weakness is the one thing no one can afford to show. But there's another side to it as well. Sometimes we say things we don't truly believe, and actions and words are misaligned. We claim to value strength, But when faced with someone stronger, we balk. We claim to despise cruelty, but when it benefits us, we turn a blind eye. It's hypocrisy at its finest, and yet it's a part of who we are. People are contradictions, walking a thin line between what they believe and what they do. They'll preach about justice yet turn around and commit the very acts they claim to despise. They'll speak of honor and loyalty yet betray those closest to them when it suits their needs. And why? Because deep down, we're all just trying to survive in a world that doesn't make sense. We latch onto beliefs, rules, and codes because they give us a semblance of order, something to hold onto in the chaos. But when the moment comes, when those beliefs are tested, that's when we see who we truly are. If I wanted to move my blade just 1 inch more, your neck would no longer be connected. Your head would be spinning on the ground, and this place would be dyed in blood. This guy before me is some sort of a leader. He was most likely a 2-star awakened, something that not many people were. They most likely thought that if they were to bring a 2-star here, they would be able to deal with me. But that cannot be the case. After all, I am a 3-star awakened, and I am not even a normal awakened myself. I am different, as my strength cannot be completely measured in terms of normal cultivation standards. The man's eyes flickered between my blade and my face, a mixture of fear and anger playing across his features. He gritted his teeth, the muscles in his jaw tightening as he tried to muster some semblance of control over the situation. If you were to do such a thing, he growled, his voice low and trembling with barely contained rage, this city won't let you go. Do you have any idea who I am? I tilted my head slightly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of my lips. No, I replied calmly, I don't know you. But I have some ideas. The man's eyes narrowed, his grip on the hilt of his sword tightening. Then, if you know it, how dare you still resist? Do you think you can get away with this? I'm not someone you can just push around. Kid, I shook my head slowly, my gaze steady and unwavering. I'm not resisting, I said, my tone even. You and your men are the ones being unreasonable. From the start, your subordinate was the first to bother me, harassing a girl here in this very inn. And then, it was you, the superior, who came looking for me with a threat, his face twisted in anger. But I could see the uncertainty creeping into his eyes. The weight of my words was starting to sink in, and the reality of the situation was becoming clearer to him. He was outmatched, both in strength and in resolve, and deep down he knew it. You think you can just do whatever you want because you're strong? He spat, his voice laced with desperation. This city has rules. There are consequences for actions like yours. I chuckled softly, the sound devoid of humor. This city has rules, you say? Then there were those rules when your men decided to harass an innocent girl? Where were those consequences when they thought they could do as they pleased without fear of retribution? The man's eyes darted around the room as if searching for support from the patrons who were watching the exchange with a mixture of fear and fascination. But there was no one here who would stand with him, not after seeing the clear disparity in power. You came here expecting me to bow to your so-called authority. I continued, my voice dropping to a cold whisper. But authority means nothing if it's built on the backs of the weak. Strength without justice is nothing more than tyranny, and I have no intention of bowing to tyrants. He opened his mouth to retort, but no words came out. In any case, thanks to you, my mood is now ruined. The man's eyes widened in surprise, his jaw clenching as he tried to process what I had just said. The shift in my demeanor was unmistakable. I was no longer interested in playing this little game of dominance. The time for talk had passed. I stood up slowly, my gaze never leaving his. Since I no longer have an appetite, let's keep things simple, I said, my tone cold and devoid of any pretense of civility. Take me to your superior. His eyes narrowed in response, confusion, and anger flashing across his face. What? He growled, clearly not expecting this turn of events. I tilted my head slightly, my expression hardening. Do you have a problem with hearing? I asked, my voice dripping with mockery. I said, take me to your superior. Now. His eyes darted to his men, who were standing behind him, uncertain and clearly uncomfortable with how things had escalated. The man's pride was on the line, and I could see the struggle in his eyes as he weighed his options. "Do you think you can just—" he began, but I cut him off with a sharp glare. "I'm not asking," I said, taking a step closer, my presence looming over him. "I'm telling you, take me to your superior or this ends here, and it won't be in your favor." The coldness in my voice left no room for argument. He could see that I wasn't bluffing, that I was prepared to follow through on my words. The realization seemed to sink in, and I could see the fear in his eyes as he finally understood the gravity of the situation. "Fine," he spat, his voice laced with bitterness. "Follow me." Without another word, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the inn, his men scrambling to follow. I waited a moment before moving, giving them just enough time to realize that they were being watched, that their every step was under scrutiny. Vitalyara's voice echoed in my mind as I followed them out. "This is a bold move, Lucavian. Are you sure about this? Of course, you are going right into the enemy's base." "Enemy?" I asked, my tone more curious than anything else. "Aren't they?" Vitalyara's voice carried a hint of confusion. "After all, you've intimidated them and threatened them. Doesn't that make them your enemies?" I shook my head slightly as I followed the man through the streets, the morning light casting long shadows on the ground. "They're certainly not people I like," I admitted, "but that doesn't automatically make them my enemies. Especially not from the city's perspective." "City's perspective?" Vitalyara's voice was laced with intrigue. "What do you mean by that?" I nodded thoughtfully as we walked. "Do you really think everyone in this city is unreasonable? That everyone acts purely out of pride and nothing else? Isn't that how humans are?" She countered, her tone skeptical. "Driven by pride, ego, and the need to prove themselves." Couldn't help but chuckle at that. "If that's what you think, then you need to broaden your horizons, Vitalyara. Sure, some people are like that, but not everyone. There are those who think beyond their pride and act with reason and purpose. They're the ones who keep a city running, who maintain order even in chaos." Vitalyara was silent for a moment as if considering my words. "You're saying there are people here who could be allies?" "Potentially," I replied, "or at least people who can be reasoned with. Not everyone in power is a brute." At that moment, the man leading me came to a halt in front of a large, imposing building. It was a sturdy structure made of weathered stone with reinforced wooden doors, the kind that had seen many years and many conflicts. He turned to face me, his expression still one of barely concealed irritation. "We've arrived," he said curtly. "Wait here. I'll call my superior." "Sure," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. As the man turned and disappeared inside the building, I took a moment to assess my surroundings. Vitalyara's voice echoed in my mind again. "You seem pretty confident that this will go your way." "Indeed I am." "How?" "You will see." A few moments passed in silence, the weight of the situation settling around me as I waited outside the building. Then, the door creaked open, and a different man stepped out. "Oh, this one is legit." Chapter 102, Roderick. The man who had taken a step outside was taller and broader than the first, his presence commanding attention. His face bore the scars of countless battles, and his eyes held the hardened look of someone who had seen more bloodshed than most could imagine. As soon as I saw him, I knew. This was someone who had been through wars, someone who had survived when others hadn't. His aura was heavy with experience, the kind that only comes from being on the front lines of countless conflicts. It is tingling. There was a certain pressure coming at him, something that I was very well accustomed to. He took one look at me, his gaze sharp and assessing, before turning to the man who had brought me here. "Hector," he said, his voice deep and gruff, tinged with a slight irritation. "You're telling me this young pup is the one who beat you and your men? Are you mocking me?" Hector, the man who had led me here, flinched slightly at the superior's tone. "No, Captain," he said quickly, his voice trembling just a bit. "He's stronger than he looks. We underestimated him." The captain narrowed his eyes at me, his expression unreadable. He seemed to be sizing me up, trying to determine if I was worth his time or if I was just another upstart looking to make a name for myself. I met his gaze evenly, refusing to be intimidated. This was a man who commanded respect, yes, but I had faced worse. Much worse. The captain's lips twitched into a small, almost imperceptible smile, though it carried no warmth. "You've got guts, kid," he said, his tone laced with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. "But guts alone don't get you far in this world." "No, they don't," I agreed, my voice steady. "But they're a good start." The captain's eyes flickered with interest, though his expression remained hard. "Puhaha." Then he suddenly laughed hard, his hand on his stomach. The captain's laughter echoed through the courtyard, a deep, almost mocking sound that carried an undercurrent of danger. His men, who had been watching in tense silence, began to close in around me, their hands resting on their weapons, eyes gleaming with anticipation. The atmosphere shifted, the tension thickening as they prepared for a possible confrontation. I could feel their bloodlust, the hunger for violence that simmered just beneath the surface. Though many of them were likely 1-star or 2-star awakened, they were still formidable in their own right. But it was the captain's aura that truly commanded attention. A pressure that marked him as a seasoned warrior, someone who had ascended to at least 3-star. The captain's laughter died down, but the smirk remained on his face as he looked at me with a mixture of amusement and disdain. "You've got a smart mouth, kid," he said, his tone laced with a warning. "But you're standing in the middle of my men. Give me one good reason why I shouldn't have them tear you apart right here and now." The men around me tensed, their hands tightening on their weapons. The captain's words hung in the air, a clear challenge and a test of my resolve. But instead of flinching, I met the captain's gaze head-on, my own expression calm and unyielding. A small smile tugged at the corner of my lips as I slowly scanned the faces of the men surrounding me, then returned my focus to the captain. "Because if you do," I began, my voice steady and unwavering, "I'm confident I'll take more than half of these men down with me." The captain's eyes narrowed, his amusement fading as he registered the seriousness in my tone. Whether I was bluffing or not, it was something that he could not measure at all. "And considering the state that this town is in, I doubt you can afford to do such a thing." I kept my gaze locked on the captain's, the tension between us palpable. He was a seasoned warrior, someone who had seen more than his share of bloodshed, but so had I. And in this standoff I knew I had the upper hand, not just because of my confidence, but because I understood the situation in this town better than he might realize. As I stared him down, my thoughts drifted back to what Harlan had told me about my mission. He wanted me to kill the bandits while keeping my sword intact. While that might just sound like a test to me, there was also another reason why he requested such a thing from me. The town had been struggling ever since most of its awakened had been sent off to war. Bandits had taken advantage of the power vacuum, preying on the weak, and those who remained were spread thin, doing their best to maintain order. Every awakened man in this town was valuable, a crucial piece in keeping the fragile peace that was left. That led to the situation where the awakened became more powerful than they were supposed to, with less authority. By making me deal with the bandits, Harlan also aimed to achieve peace. And that simultaneously affected the city as well, just like the captain before me. And that's exactly why he won't risk a fight he can't afford, I thought, my confidence solidifying. The captain's eyes flickered with a mix of calculation and doubt. He was weighing the potential cost of pushing this any further, and I could see the moment he decided it wasn't worth it. His men were watching him, waiting for his decision, and I knew he wouldn't gamble their lives or his own on a fight that could leave them weakened. Finally, he let out a low, rumbling chuckle, the tension easing just a fraction. "You're not wrong," he admitted, his tone grudging. "This town's hanging on by a thread, and I can't afford to lose any more good men." I held his gaze, my expression unchanging. "Exactly. We both know the value of keeping your forces intact, especially in a place like this." The captain studied me for another moment, then laughed again, the sound rough but genuine this time. "You're good, kid. Real good. I was testing you, and it seems you passed. Now, what do you want?" I allowed a small smile to grace my lips, knowing I had gained a measure of respect from this man. "Why don't we discuss that somewhere more comfortable?" The captain's laughter rumbled once more, and he shook his head in amusement. Right, right. Where are my manners? He turned and gestured for me to follow. Come on then. We'll talk inside. As I followed him into the building, Vital Yara's voice echoed in my mind. You played that well. I knew he wouldn't take the risk, I replied mentally. It's all about knowing what cards to play and when. You really are reckless. Hee hee. As I stepped into the building, the heavy wooden door creaked shut behind me, cutting off the outside world. The room was dimly lit, with a few flickering lamps casting long shadows on the walls. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of aged wood and the faint aroma of tobacco, creating a sense of age and history that permeated the space. The captain led me to a small table near the back of the room, where he finally stopped and turned to face me. His expression was slightly more relaxed now, the tension from our earlier encounter having eased. I realize I forgot to introduce myself, he said, a touch of amusement in his voice. Name's Roderick. I'm the one responsible for the garrison here. Lucavian, I replied with a nod. Just a traveler passing through. Roderick let out a low chuckle as he gestured for me to take a seat at the table. Well, Lucavian, it seems you've already made quite an impression here in Rakenshore. That was not my intention. I took the offered seat, my eyes scanning the room out of habit before settling on Roderick again. He waved to a nearby attendant, who quickly brought over a tray with a steaming pot of tea and 2 cups. The captain poured the tea himself, a small gesture of respect that didn't go unnoticed. We sat in silence for a moment, the only sounds being the soft clink of porcelain and the distant murmur of voices outside. Roderick took a sip of his tea before finally speaking, his tone more serious now. So what is it that you want, Lucavian? You didn't come here just to show off your skills. There's something on your mind. I nodded, setting my cup down as I met his gaze. You're right. I didn't come here just for a fight. Roderick raised an eyebrow, clearly interested. Go on. I leaned forward slightly, my voice steady as I explained. Rakenshore is hanging by a thread, as you said. The bandits around here are a threat not just to the villagers but to the stability of this town. They're taking advantage of the power vacuum left by the war, and it's only a matter of time before things get even worse. Roderick nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing in thought. And you think you can change that? I can, I replied confidently. I am going to clean this place,